Well, thanks again for coming back, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Perfect. So, well, as usual, we'll start with a little prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you again for another nice night. We thank you for the warming weather. We thank you for all this time together. We thank you for bringing us here safely. We pray that you please bless this time together, and please help everyone to get home safely. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, well, I think most of you have been here before. Thanks again for coming back. This is part 2 on evolution. After this, we'll transition a little bit into some other topics in this area. But let's talk about, again, just a brief review of where we've been. Again, I'm going to probably say this over and over again because I think it's important, but why do we study this? Why do we talk about this? Well, again, if you undermine Genesis, you undermine the entire Bible. Very, very important that we have faith in the Bible from Genesis 1:1 to the end of Revolution. God and the Bible define truth, quote-unquote, science does not. And when viewing science through a biblical lens, we can find much about science that affirms creation and actually challenges evolution. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've covered some of the basics of evolution. We've talked about microevolution, small changes within a species, versus macroevolution, the molecules to man, the start from very simple all the way up to the very complex, the thing that we're taught every day in public schools. Again, evolution is change that occurs slowly through the mutation of genes. We talked a couple times about basic cellular biology, that DNA is the code for life, RNA is how that code is transferred, and protein is what is built from that code. Protein catalyzes, meaning induces, certain reactions that result in cells functioning. And last week, we started to eat away at the foundations of evolution. We talked about the idea of irreducible complexity, the idea that certain systems are so complex and so interdependent on each part that they could not have evolved one gene at a time. We talked about the statistical problems of evolution, the issue with random chance, the idea of 1 in cajillion, and how impossible things become. And then we've talked about the endless missing links and intermediate species and things that we don't see that way. So, I went home to try to look up some of the questions that I got from last week. Someone asked a question about an epigenome or epigenetics, and actually I forgot I had read a little bit about this before, but it's a really interesting concept that gene expression is influenced by environment, somewhat by what you eat, somewhat by the environment that you're in, and some of that expression can be passed on to future generations beyond just DNA. But the DNA itself becomes, quote-unquote, tagged, if you will. So Answers in Genesis has a pretty good article on this topic, and they use this example. They use the same sentence in 2 different concepts. So a woman without her man is nothing. But, said differently, a woman without her man is nothing. So the point here being that it's the same words, the same DNA, but the punctuation or the tags on the DNA completely change the meaning. And so the words are the same, the tags are different and dramatically change the meaning. And so they had an interesting experiment where they took some obese mice, and you'd be amazed how much obese mice are studied. And they fed them 2 different diets. One was a standard diet, and then another one was a diet known to modify these tags. And then they looked at their offspring. So they looked at the kids of these mice that should be passing on the obesity gene. And the kids of the mice that were fed a standard diet were still obese. But interestingly, the offspring of the mice with the modified diet were not. Same genes, just different expression, i.e. different punctuation. Now another example had to do with looking at human women who had taken a synthetic estrogen to prevent miscarriages, and unfortunately their daughters and granddaughters actually have higher rates of cancer. Somehow this intake of estrogen modified certain tags on DNA, raising their rates of cancer. The main thing I take from epigenetics and the epigenome is, as is always the case in everything we study in science, the more we learn about it, the more complex it gets, and the more Darwin was in over his head, the more difficult it is to believe in evolution. I got asked about what people answer, how evolutionists answer irreducible complexity, so I tried to look this up. And I found several proposed answers. One was that proteins used in many systems had completely other roles in other species, and some of those species may now have become extinct. Fine, but this goes back to what we talked about with non-falsifiability. You start with your premise that this is how it happened, and now let's just create some way for it to happen. They have no evidence of this. This is just something they propose. Richard Dawkins, I don't know if any of you know who he is, he was kind enough on YouTube to tell me that if I didn't understand how stuff evolved, I was simply too stupid. And that was almost literally his 5-minute YouTube, was just because you're too stupid to understand how it evolves and in complexity roles doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Now, he couldn't explain it. He just said you're too stupid. So that's as far as we got there. I found another great YouTube cartoon proposing how the eye could evolve, and really pretty pictures. I mean, it was great. They drew a lot of pictures, and that's how most of evolution is done. You draw a lot of pictures. There was no real science in this. They just said, well, one day there was mucus, and this mucus hardened and formed a lens. No explanation. I did find one scientific article proposing how the immune system could have been put together. Incredibly long article. I was really tired. I didn't have 2 hours to read it, but I did read enough of it. I do appreciate the effort. Let's just summarize it this way. I appreciate the effort. I'm not convinced. He looked at very small parts of the immune system, a lot of suppositions, a lot of guesswork. At least somebody's trying, but I will say this kind of stuff's actually hard to find. Evolutionists actually trying to answer any of these are more difficult to find. And then there was a great question about plant evolution and trees, and I don't think he's here tonight after all my work. Oh, there you are. Okay, I didn't see it. This is perfect. So I could not find specifics on trees. Every time I looked up trees, it wanted to show me an evolutionary tree, but I did look up plants. So the proposed theory from evolutionists is that plants started evolving 400 million years ago. Seed plants 360 million years ago. Flowering plants 130 million years ago. And in theory, the way they explain it is that algae moved from water to land. No real explanation of how this happened, but then the algae sort of evolved some of these traits and became trees. All of the same problems that we talked about in animal evolution exist in plant evolution. There's a lack of intermediate species. There's the same issues with irreducible complexity, and one interesting thing I found is that the need for pollinators. We all know flowering plants need bees, but actually bees need to be very specific size to fit in certain flowers. So those two things had to evolve conveniently at the exact same time, which seems highly unlikely. One of the most interesting things I found was the bristlecone pine in the Rocky Mountains are the oldest trees that we could find, and they date to about 4,700 years ago. Which would make sense because that's about when the first plant life should have existed after the flood. So that's as much as I could find on trees. I apologize I couldn't find more detailed stuff. So any other questions from last week or things that people were pondering? All right, perfect. So we're going to move on to several other topics tonight in the specific areas of evolution. So the one that we probably see the most is the monkey to man evolution. So you've all seen cartoons like this where we were walking on our hands until we got our iPhones. The problem here once again goes to intermediate species. I know what this is. I know what this is. I've never seen any of these things. So evolutionists have tried to present us numerous examples. And so I want to examine a few of these that you may or may not have heard of. So Java Man, discovered again shortly after Darwin's publication of his book, was found in Indonesia. And this was thought to represent a missing link from apes to humans. And this is arguably one of the best known fossils. In fact, they grouped this as its own species, Homo erectus. Remember, we are Homo sapiens. This is Homo erectus. And this is what he looked like. And the way we know he looked like this is because we have this stuff. And so we got 3 fossils and a whole lot of creativity. Okay. So further study of these has actually shown that the excavation techniques were extremely poor, and likely this femur does not belong with this skull. This skull is clearly human, And even though it's small, it's within the realm of normal. So you've got a femur, a skull, and a tooth. Nebraska Man. Anybody? We're from Nebraska. I'd never heard of this until I started reaching. Anybody? Yeah, okay, all right. So I'm proud somebody's actually heard of this. I was very excited about this. There's a rancher. I don't know if those exist around here, but there's a rancher in Nebraska that discovered a fascinating tooth back in 1917, and appeared to be a tooth of a very sophisticated ape. And this was actually published. These pictures were in London Illustrated News. And the Scopes monkey trial, when we were having the discussion about should evolution be taught in schools, they used Nebraska Man as an important intermediate species and why we know that evolution exists. Does anybody know what happened to Nebraska Man? That's right. Further excavation was done, and additional bones were discovered in addition to this tooth that they found. Turns out this is a tooth from an extinct wild pig. Now, the blame was, well, gosh, we were trying and the tooth just got exposed to a bunch of weathering, and we thought that this was an intermediate species. Now, this wasn't a hoax per se, but it does speak to the speed of which evolutionists will rush to find anything to suggest a missing link from apes to man. Piltdown Man, anybody heard about this? This is probably the most famous example. Charles Dawson produced a fossil in 1912. It was clearly a missing link. Ape-like jawbone, teeth wear similar to humans, and a very human-like skull. And this is Piltdown Man. For over 50 years, this was the missing link. 1953 conclusively proven to be an absolute hoax. Skull was a 500-year-old human skull, and the jaw was a modern orangutan. The teeth of jaw had been ground down. One tooth, somebody, when they were making the fake, filed it too hard, and they actually had to fill the tooth. Yet they were so anxious to have a missing link that anybody would accept it. And again, it comes back to religion. Who's more religious on this? So Lucy, another very, very famous example. I tried to practice this last night, pronouncing Australopithecus afarensis, and that's as close as I can get. But discovered in Africa in 1974. This was an early link between apes and man. It's a 3 feet tall human with, importantly, hands and feet like humans. I'm sorry, not a human. 3 feet tall humanoid, I should have said, or ape that has hands and feet. Ultimately, Lucy is clearly an ape. These were long-armed knuckle walkers. The hands are actually very similar to chimpanzees, and the feet are long, curved, and muscular. The only purpose for those feet would be tree dwelling, not for walking in a human-like fashion. This just happens to be a variant of an ape. Anybody heard of the Neanderthals? Okay. So the Neanderthals, the poor Neanderthals, have been ruined by evolutionists. Their remains were first discovered in the 1850s in something called the Neander Valley. So technically, if you'll read about them, they actually are called Neanderthals. I don't know where the H got added, but they aren't actually Neanderthals. They were originally Homo sapiens. And then Darwin published his book, and suddenly they were Homo neanderthalensis. And Virchow, who I'll come back to, is a famous physician who originally studied these, but suffice it to say, they were originally thought to be human, and then they were known to be a separate species, an intermediate species. And as we know, they're classified by their prominent eyebrows, low forehead, long and narrow skull, protruding upper jaw, strong lower jaw, and short chin. They have deep-chested, large-boned individuals. In 1908, Marcelin Boulay studied this group and determined they were intellectually inferior. These were slumped over, ape-like posture, and told us that these were Neanderthals. How many of you men have been called a Neanderthal? Unfairly. And these views were held and expanded until the 1950s, that the Neanderthals were big, dumb animals. Well, in 1957, two anatomists actually examined the remains and determined what really was going on with the Neanderthals. They actually suffered from something called rickets. And this was Virchow, who's famous actually in all of medicine, but has a lot of things in cardiology that are known. This is how he actually originally classified the Neanderthals when he was studying them in the 1800s. That these were simply humans with a bad form of arthritis. Well, this fits perfectly. If you haven't heard of rickets, it's a vitamin D deficiency. And it what it does is erode your bones and makes your knees turn out in a certain way. And the Neanderthals were cave dwellers. They had very little exposure to the sun, and they had extremely poor diets. They didn't get vitamin D in their diets. They didn't get vitamin D from the sun, and they had rickets. The Neanderthal brain size, based on the capacity, it's actually larger than the average human. And all of the described features that we talked about for Neanderthals are actually within normal limits for a human being. So most of the archaeological evidence now looking at Neanderthals is these were actually sophisticated cultures. They had music, they had tools, they had all the things that humans would have. They're simply humans, not apes. And this is not something that I emphasize a lot in this talk, but a lot of early evolution was some of the foundations of racism and judgment of different races based on how they thought evolution occurred, and Neanderthals were simply an example of that. So, the fundamental problems of the ape to man evolution. Most of these icons of evolution are based on drawings with very, very few fossils. A few teeth here, a separate bone there. We're going to draw a whole species and tell you what they looked like. There ultimately is no missing link. And even if there was, where is it today? Why do we still have apes and we still have orangutans, and we have humans, but we have absolutely nothing in between? The problem is that archaeologists and paleontologists and all the people tell us this, they start with an evolutionary frame of mind, and then try to make the fossils fit. And this is why we end up with things like Nebraska Man and Piltdown Man, and some become desperate enough to just engineer hoaxes. And that's not how science is supposed to work, and it's an absolute science denial to pretend that it is. So moving on to the problem of consciousness. So what is consciousness? Self-awareness, creativity, thinking, art, math, science, these are all examples of consciousness that separate us from the animals. So how exactly does one evolve those traits? And at what point in the apes to man theory does the organism become conscious? Anybody? What exactly is the survival advantage of being a renowned artist, a Michelangelo, an incredible philosopher like Descartes? In a world driven only by survival of the fittest, how does a moral man, who might oppose murder, rape, etc., pass on his genes better than one who doesn't mind killing his enemy and forcibly passing on his genes? Why is there any advantage to art, to creativity, to science, to literature, to any of the consciousness that we have? So ask yourself what makes more sense. An infinite mind creates a man with a finite mind? Or chemicals with no soul, direction, or desire slowly evolve into an alert, conscious human brain? If the mind emerged from random matter rather than intelligence, why do we trust anything that comes from it? Just a thought. It's like having a computer or calculator programmed randomly rather than by an intelligent human. How do you trust anything it produced? So, an additional problem for evolutionists is how you get human consciousness from purely neurologic biologic cells. I.e., how do you take the nerve pathways that make my arm move, that make me blink my eyes? How do you create human awareness and personality and culture from those things? All animals share many traits and organs and concepts, but only humans have consciousness. Only humans are really aware that they are alive. Dogs may be sweet, but they're not aware they're alive. Christians have a much easier way to answer these issues, and it's with a soul. So ultimately you have to ask yourself what makes more sense. So the starting point, and this is where we'll spend a fair amount of time tonight. Okay, define life for me. Anybody? Okay. It's tough to define, but like the Supreme Court said about obscenity, they know it when they see it. I think we all know what life is, and we can recognize it when we see it. We all clearly know what death is. So when do molecules actually constitute life? And that's an important and difficult question. But for argument's sake, just for the purpose of discussion, I think we can define a functioning cell, a single cell, as life, while everything in the cell, all the proteins and the DNA and all of that, are the precursor of life. At least that's how I've defined it for the purpose of this talk. So remember that picture of the cell I showed you last week with all the various structures in it, all the different parts, the DNA, the RNA, the ribosomes that build the proteins, the Golgi apparatus that extrudes the proteins. How do you get all of those things at once? It's almost the irreducible complexity of the cell itself. DNA is completely useless without RNA or without other proteins to copy the DNA. There's something in your cells called DNA polymerase that copies your DNA so you can put it into other cells, so you can pass it on. So you can have all the DNA in the world you want, but without DNA polymerase, it's only going to be there one time. You need something to replicate it. And even if you had something to turn DNA to RNA, great, now you got RNA. It's sitting there doing nothing. It needs everything else to turn it into protein. So what we're told by evolutionists is that billions of years ago, have anybody heard of the primordial soup before? We all came from a primordial soup. So there was a mixture of very, very basic chemicals that formed this basis of life. And something, we're not told what, but something led those chemicals to somehow bind in a way that produced organic molecules. And this became the starting point of life. This was our primordial soup. These are your great-great-great-great-grandparents. So there's a very famous experiment, and this is quoted to me all the time when I discuss evolution with people, done in the 1950s, the Miller-Urey Experiment. And what they did here is they simulated this early atmosphere and provided an electrical spark. And amazingly, they were able to generate amino acids. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. We're all made of proteins, and amino acids are the little part. They're the alphabet of the proteins. Excuse me. And so this suggested that life could be created from simply a gas and a spark. And he was able to take this, basically what he did is took this mixture of ammonia, hydrogen gas, methane, water, and provided a spark. And he had this fancy system, and then he eventually was able to produce these amino acids. Well, let's talk about the problems with his experiment. The first problem, his atmosphere was very likely wrong. He used a very hydrogen-rich atmosphere, composed, like I said, of methane, ammonia, and water vapor. But most modern evolutionary scientists will tell us that the original atmosphere was carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. So what happens if we apply that same spark? What do we get there? Formaldehyde, cyanide, all those useful building blocks that you've heard of. The second is that he did this in an atmosphere without oxygen. Great idea, because that's the only way he could do it. What's the problem with oxygen? It destroys amino acids. Kind of defeats the whole purpose. But what if there is, okay, let's say there is no oxygen. So if there is oxygen, the amino acids are destroyed. What happens if there's not oxygen? Anybody know what the ozone layer is made of? So oxygen you breathe is O2. Ozone is O3. So ozone layer is what protects us from the sun's UV rays. Without the ozone layer, all life would be destroyed. Same thing happens with amino acids. Without that ozone layer, amino acids are destroyed. So if the early atmosphere had oxygen, the oxygen destroys amino acids. If it doesn't have oxygen, the UV rays destroy amino acids. This is the ultimate catch-22. It doesn't matter what it is, these amino acids couldn't have been formed this way. What's the third problem? Okay, bear with me, a little basic science here, I'm sorry. This was actually my worst subject in college, was organic chemistry. But the third problem is something called chirality. So molecules that are made of, and this is an example of a carbon-based molecule that we see here. They actually have handedness, just like your right and your left hand. Okay? When molecules form, they form something called a racemic mixture, meaning you get a 50% left-handed, 50% right-handed version of the molecule. These are mirror images of each other. And so in the Miller-Urey experiments, when we created these amino acids, we got 50% right-handed amino acids and 50% left-handed amino acids. Well, what's the problem with that? In all of life, only left-handed exists. So his idea that we could create in the atmosphere, early atmosphere, amino acids, he created them, but he created ones that don't exist in life. We are all made of left-handed amino acids. Nobody has right-handed. In fact, inserting the right-handed absolutely destroys the protein. So what's the fourth problem? Very artificial environment, carefully planned by what? Intelligent life. What? Intelligent life. Intelligent, okay. Not just some random collision of molecules. And here's the most important problem. So what if you get amino acids? That still doesn't get you proteins. And even if it does, those proteins don't store information. That requires DNA or RNA. Amino acids alone do not constitute life, and in fact are not even close. So he was able to produce, theoretically, in the lab, some molecules that don't exist in the real world in a fake environment, and we're supposed to believe that that proves the starting point. Everybody got it? Okay. Because science. So evolutionists have recognized these problems and have said, okay, fine. We're going to do something different. We're going to say that life started with self-replicating RNA and proteins, etc. Great, except they don't exist and nobody can find them. And once again, that's a nice theory, but you're starting with your non-falsifiability again. You're starting with, I know the answer, and let me just invent something to come up with it. Now, they have, in very carefully instructed experiments and environments, produced some self-replicating RNAs, and peptides is another word for proteins. And they argue that this is evidence for abiogenesis, which means creation of life from non-living compounds. Well, here are the problems. Number one, these are extremely artificial environments. Two, these molecules serve no other function than to self-replicate. They don't produce anything, they just produce themselves over and over and over and over and over. These molecules were synthesized, meaning created in a lab, and they are not found naturally anywhere. And once again, it's a huge step to go from these molecules to actual life. So, excuse me. So again, we can't define a single origin point for which life can begin. Like I said at the beginning, what good is DNA without RNA? What good is amino acids without ribosomes? Ribosomes are the things that construct the proteins out of amino acids. So I've offered this challenge to many evolutionists, and nobody will take me up on it. I'll give you a cell. We'll put it into a test tube full of saline, and I'm going to poke a hole in the cell. And everything's going to leak out. But you got all the components. You got everything to make a cell. Do anything you want to it. Spark it, centrifuge it, do whatever you want, make it live again. And nobody can do it. Now this is despite the fact that you have all of the necessary components. You have everything already evolved and ready for you to go, and you can't turn that into life. So how do you expect me to believe that you started with nothing and turned it into what we have now? So, moving on to bad mutations. So, when you think of mutations, if you're a boy like me who grew up in the 80s, this is usually what I think of. Sorry, salty dinner. And the question is always, is it generally beneficial to be a mutant? Sure, in the comic books it's great. In real life, I'm not so sure. Remember that we talked about what mutation is. Mutation is a change in DNA that results in coding for different information or different proteins. I cannot emphasize this enough, and you'll probably see this written on several of my slides here, but the vast majority of mutations are bad. They result in missing or a corrupted protein that loses its function. So I'm sure some of you have heard about various genetic diseases, cystic fibrosis, hemophilia that we talked about last time, Tay-Sachs disease, which is more rare. These are all mutations. They're all bad. I'm sure all of you know somebody who's lost a baby in utero, meaning they had a miscarriage. Almost all of these were genetic defects that were unrecoverable. That's the vast majority of miscarriages. And once again, the evolutionists simply tell me that, Ross, it took a lot of time. So what about mutations that add function? We have mutations that add function. We call it cancer. A cell that proliferates very aggressively without any control is a cancerous cell by definition. Adding a bunch of DNA, even if that happened, would be useless as it codes for nothing. And actually, extra DNA in a cell is a hindrance because it becomes a waste of energy. So unless that DNA is doing something useful, if you just throw a bunch of DNA in there, that does nothing for you. Now this next point is a little bit of a tricky concept, but actually I'm going to come back to that. Sorry, it's on a different slide. What about adding genetic information? Well, when you add a whole extra chromosome to people, to a fertilized embryo, you either get a miscarriage or you get something called Down syndrome, Edwards syndrome, or Patau syndrome. I think you've all heard of Downs. I don't think most have heard of Edwards or Patau. But basically, we all are made up of 23 pairs of chromosomes. If you add a whole extra chromosome to that embryo, you end up with a very sick baby with one of these syndromes. And if you end up with a what's called a trisomy, a 3 chromosomes of any other numbered chromosome, those babies die very quickly and don't make it to birth. So here's another example I like to use as somebody with 2800 vision, and I've had that since I was a kid pretty much. I always like to look at it this way. So let's look at this on a larger scale. Anybody in here else wear contacts or glasses? All right, welcome to the club. All right. So glasses came about in the 13th century, but actually most were unaffordable until modern times. So go ahead and explain to me how people with awful vision survived 5 minutes against prehistoric animals or the numerous prehistoric battles. I'll tell you what, I take my contacts out at night. I need my wife to guide me to bed if I don't have my glasses. And I think you can relate. And I think this picture, for those of you who don't wear glasses, I mean, feel very blessed. I'm happy for you. But this is my life, okay? This may be your life, this is my life. And this is the life that everybody would have lived until we had glasses. So poor vision should have been weeded out a long time ago, as this is clearly a survival disadvantage. And these same arguments actually exist for things like short stature, guilty, and handedness. Why aren't there ambidextrous people everywhere? Why do we bother having a right-handedness or left-handedness? And better yet, like I asked you all last week, where is that person with 3 or 4 arms who would beat the living patootie out of the 2-armed person and pass on their genes that way? So the idea of beneficial mutations. What is, in theory, a beneficial mutation? Well, it's something that helps an organism survive in a new environment and gives it an advantage over its ilk. So what if the environment changes again? Is there still an advantage? So let me give you an example. Penicillin, we've talked about this many times. Penicillin is a common antibiotic that destroys bacteria. The way it destroys bacteria is bacteria has what's called a cell wall that encloses everything in that cell. And penicillin actually integrates itself into that wall and destroys it so that everything in the cell leaks out. So resistant bacteria build a different wall structure so that penicillin can't integrate. But will that same cell hold up better than a normal cell when penicillin isn't present? Or will the normal bacteria now reproduce faster? So what I'm saying is penicillin resistance is very useful to a bacteria when penicillin is around. But if you take that, and that's a natural selection, evolutionary advantage, but if you take that same bacteria and put it into a normal environment where penicillin isn't around, actually it's not going to reproduce as well as the normal bacteria will. So it's very so what we view as beneficial really depends on the environment. So also, is a beneficial mutation really an improvement, or is it just a modification of an existing structure? In other words, did the bacteria come up with a whole new cell wall? No, of course not. It simply mildly changed its wall that it has. How far can we take these beneficial mutations? Well, not very far, right? Not far enough to get molecules to man. And you cannot substantially gain new proteins or traits in nature. You can just modify existing one. In other words, we don't see fish growing legs. So let me give you a really interesting example from a devout evolutionist. There's a professor named Barry Hall who's at the University of Rochester, and he worked with E. coli. We've talked about E. coli a lot. This is used in a lot of scientific studies. Never mind, it's a gross fact, I'll tell you later. Something I learned in college. Sorry. let's just say you have a lot of E. coli in you. We'll leave it at that. So humans actually have a lot of E. coli in them. This professor, he bred a species of E. coli that could no longer break down lactose as a food source. Lactose is a sugar, just like we all eat sugars and we process them that way. E. coli uses lactose as one of their sources of food, and so it breaks down lactose to turn it into energy. So he bred these bacteria that could no longer use lactose as a food source. And he said, all right, I'm going to force evolution on these bacteria. I know they can't break down lactose. I'm going to put them in an environment where there's nothing but lactose. That's their only source of food. Now go. Now evolve. And the bacteria did evolve and survived. And he praised the high heavens that evolutionists praise and said, I've proven evolution. Well, subsequent studies showed that the E. coli actually had a separate gene, which was capable of very weakly breaking down lactose. He had missed this. When he bred these E. coli that couldn't use lactose, he didn't realize there was this other gene that allowed them, in a tiny amount, to break down lactose. And with very, very small modifications of that gene, it became much more efficient and was able to break down lactose very, very well. So, was this a gain of a new gene? No. It was simply a modification of an existing gene with very, very subtle mutation. It was not a new protein that showed up to break down lactose. This was not a new gene. This was not an example of beneficial mutation. So he said, okay, I'm going to knock out that gene. Now I've got my new E. coli that can't use lactose, they can't use the backup system. Let's do this again. Let's put you in the lactose solution, and let's repeat the experiment. What do you think happened? They all died. He could not get the bacteria to quote-unquote evolve a new trait. He killed lots of bacteria trying. But, like a good evolutionist, he concluded, quote, given a sufficient number of substitutions, additions, deletions, the sequence of any gene can evolve into the sequence of any other gene. So even though his own experiment proved him wrong, he still had to make his prayer to the evolutionary gods and say, yep, this is how it happens. This is another example of evolutionists speaking purely out of faith rather than science. Coming back to microevolution, I do want to make a note on this, and I've used this term a lot because I think it makes it simpler to break things down into microevolution and macroevolution, those small changes versus the major changes where you're changing into different organisms. And really, I want to be careful to make this point that microevolution is really a variance of genetic expression, like what we saw in that experiment. You had a protein that could weakly break down lactose. It changes slightly and it can better break it down. You didn't develop something new. You took what you had and changed it slightly. Developing a new or novel protein which adds benefit is extremely rare, and I would say probably impossible. I don't think we have an example of this. And actually, most of what we observe in variants today is actually loss of genetic information. You had a lot of genetic information, you lost it, and that's how you got your variant. And we're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to Noah's Ark and how he was able to bring the animals on and how we got the animals that we have from today. But suffice it to say that early man and early animal probably had a lot more genetic information than modern man and modern animal. You really only needed one very genetically complex dog to produce all the different breeds, but your Chihuahua has lost information that your Husky has not, and the opposite. But really, most of the variants are loss of information. The gain of genetic data. Evolutionists are really hard-pressed to show us any evidence of genetic information ever being added to the genetic code. Most of what we are shown, most of the examples, are simply small modifications of existing proteins, or at best, combinations of existing proteins. And most examples will show organisms adapting to different environments, like we talked about, the bacteria becoming antibiotic resistant. Again, most of those adaptations actually come at a cost, and once the environmental pressure is removed, those adapted organisms don't do as well. So it may be an advantage for a time. We may be in the middle of an ice age and it's an advantage now, but it's actually a disadvantage when we go back to normal condition. There really is no example of an organism developing a completely new protein on its own. So finally, I want to talk about some miscellaneous answers to evolution and things I like to point out. Concept called hydrolysis. Water. Water is incredible. Water is fascinating. Water is key to life. My father has a real passion for water. Sorry, he tells me all about his studies of water. But one thing water does is it breaks down bonds between chemicals, and it breaks down amino acids. So knowing this, how could life have started in water? In the same way that oxygen would break down amino acids, water will break down amino acids. Let's talk a little bit about the complexity of the information, and this is always fascinating to me, but DNA codes for information far, far more complex than computer software. Yet it takes thousands of engineers to write programs like Windows or iOS. And given that information, how can random chance even begin to form DNA that would code for the complexities of a single cell, let alone an entire organism? We all marvel at what I think I'd said this before, what Steve Jobs was able to do. But it pales in comparison to what God does with even the simplest flower. So this is my absolute favorite argument against evolution, and this is my go-to. So if you want to take one thing from my entire talk on evolution, this is my favorite argument. Evolution should have happened the other way around. Let me explain this. From an evolutionary standpoint, what is the ideal organism? Number one, it's an effective procreator. It can pass on its genetic material quickly and efficiently. It's able to survive in a multitude of environments and situations. It can avoid predators, toxic substances, poisons, etc., and it's very difficult to get rid of. This is the ideal organism. Is that humans? It takes two people 20 years to be able to produce a single offspring. And that offspring is not capable of independent living for 12 to 15 years, maybe longer, depending on the offspring. Humans can only live in finite temperatures and locations. We've all heard our wives tell us how cold they are. Just kidding. Don't tell my wife. But for the things that humans create, our housing, our weapons, our etc., we couldn't survive in a wild environment. Tigers, pestilent, frigid temperatures, all of these things would dominate us. In terms of survival of the fittest, humans are probably the least evolved creatures on the planet. What's the most evolved organism? Well, close. Cockroach, actually, we have an interesting topic about cockroaches, because they'll tell you that, and evolutionists will tell you they have not evolved. And anyway, that's a whole separate topic. I think I have something on that. But yes, that's close. I would say bacteria. A single bacteria can form an offspring bacteria in a matter of minutes and do it many, many, many times. Bacteria can and do survive in almost any environment, including Antarctica, the depths of the ocean, even the volcanoes. Doesn't matter where you go, you're going to find bacteria. Bacteria can rapidly adapt to numerous environmental pressures. We all know that. That's why we deal with antibiotic resistance like crazy in the world of medicine. And as any of you know, because you get those little wipes, eradicating bacteria is virtually impossible. Ultimately, bacteria is the most highly evolved, efficient organism out there, period. All higher forms of life should have died off in favor of this pinnacle of evolution. So, some concluding thoughts on this in general. We've talked about several of the many flaws of evolution. There are other flaws and problems, and I could have gone on a lot longer, but time is of the essence. And I would encourage you to think of your own or even research others. This is one of my favorite topics with my dad and other people, is just to try to come up with things that are flaws. I hope you now understand why I feel evolution is a faith-based theory. what I want you all to take from this is please don't be intimidated by the so-called science of evolution. It is a faith, it is not a science. Remember finally, the vast majority of people you meet blindly accept evolution without really understanding any science. And even a few of the things we've discussed may get them thinking. Nobody expects you to debate PhDs. They're arrogant anyway. Ultimately, remember that this is a battle for souls. It doesn't really matter if somebody believes in evolution or not, right? It's just like Ken Ham said, the important thing is believing in Christ. But we don't want to undermine our foundations. And secularists want us to accept evolution so that they don't have to accept their need for a savior. So where are we going to go from here? We've spent the last couple of weeks talking about evolution specifically. I want to spend the next 2 sessions discussing the age of the earth. The age of the earth and those arguments are some of the most threatening arguments against secularists. Why is that? Because the answer to everything I've just shown you of all the problems with evolution is it took a lot of time. And you just don't understand how long a billion is. Therefore, if the earth could be proved or suggested to be only 6,000 years old, as the Bible tells us it is, all the other discussions we've had about evolution are moot. And this is why secularists fight this age argument so fiercely. Quick reminder that I'm out of town in 2 weeks, so part 1 of the earth will be next week. Part 2 will be 2 weeks. In between, though, I'm going to show 2 videos, so I would still invite you to come and see these. They're both phenomenal. One is Ken Ham's talk called In 6 Days, and it's a great discussion of the importance of 6 days. And one is a really fascinating video about a very brilliant guy, I wish I was this smart, who went to a college campus and slowly interviewed a bunch of evolutionists and students and asked them some of these basic questions about evolution. And it is a fascinating study on what their answers are and how he shows the arc of their change over his course of discussion. And I think it is worth your time to come see those. So we will still have something there. And so that's all I have to say about that. This is my email again. It's rpacini1@yahoo. So if folks are nervous or intimidated to ask questions or didn't understand something, please feel free to email me. I am happy to discuss anything. So, yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 Why is he not in trouble? Well. Yeah, I mean, fair question, but who's going to police him, right? I mean, most of people around him are secularists and evolutionists, and more importantly, even if they're not, their jobs are on the line, right? I mean, if you say some of the things that I'm saying here, and you say it in an academic environment, you'd lose your tenure. They have no problem doing that. So a lot of this is suppressed until you can get it out there. And you're and of course he had to conclude that. Of course he has to write that if he wants to keep his friends. Deep down, do I think he really believes that? No. I bet deep down he's questioning. He's just not allowed to say it out loud. So, yes, yeah. Yeah, correct. What else can I answer? Nothing. Was that clear, huh? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. female. That's actually I never thought of that. That's actually a very good point. I'll have to think more on that. You're exactly right. I mean, I guess the answer would be that the new animal, the male, had this gene, and it was the old ant was still able to mate with the female, but that gene got passed on. I mean, I'm just conjecture, but I think that's a very legitimate question. But I don't know why you hate science. So. Yeah. No, that's a fair question. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. I can't. Sorry. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a really fair question. You're talking about teaching in a public school type of environment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, that's a fantastic question. I don't know if I personally have a perfect answer, although when Dr. Mortensen is here from Answers in Genesis, I would actually ask him that exact same question because they will have plenty of experience. They do have teachers in public school environments, and they have advice. I mean, you have to be careful, right? Because it's your job on the line, and it's your. At the same time, I think it is fair to present the way I would do it. I guess is I would present whatever garbage they tell me I have to present, but I would for me personally, I would try to incorporate some of the questions. Here are some unanswered questions is probably a good way to put it. These are some things that are still out there for evolution to answer for us. What this, what that is maybe the most politically, and it depends on what your principle says and what you can get away with, but you don't want to you don't want to jeopardize your job at the same time. These are important battles, and I'm glad people like you are in the education environment. It was easier for me because I was a student, and so as a student, I was able to to raise my hand and get no answers, but at least get other people to think. So if you have any students that you can, I hate to say plant, but if they can ask you a question, then you're I think entitled to at least answer the question. But that is, I wish I had a perfect answer for you, other than to tell you I'm sorry, and that's a really difficult scenario. But I would encourage you to ask Dr. Mortensen that question when he's here from AIG, because I think they do have resources for that. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 I think that's a fair point. I mean, yes, and because a lot of evolutionary theories were used to incite a lot of racism and a lot of judgment early on, and that's well known. In fact, Ken Ham has a very good book about that, One Race, One Blood. That's very interesting to talk about that. So that's a good thought as well. Good. Great. Okay, I think if nobody else has any questions, Randy